The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called on the Security Council to guarantee that basic human rights are respected in Afghanistan. Guterres has described the rising tensions in the Middle Eastern country as a global terrorist threat. The withdrawal of American forces there has disrupted ongoing humanitarian efforts. Let's touch now on that aspect with Africa Muslim Agency CEO Imraan Choonara as well. He joins me alongside Senior Research Fellow at Africa-Asia Dialogues, Thembisa Fakude. Gentlemen, good evening. Good to have you with us tonight on In Focus. Imraan, let's begin with you. 20 years on after United States forces entered Afghanistan, this is what it has come down to. Did the military lose its fight, or is it just disintegrated, not interested to fight?
Well, I think, first of all, thanks for having us on this evening. And I think the question in everybody's mind really is, how does this affect the person on the street, frankly, in Afghanistan? Because, my experience globally as a humanitarian, we operate in many, many countries around the world. And in Afghanistan specifically, you understand very, very real when you're actually on the ground. That doesn't matter what happens politically. I know it does matter. But when it gets down to the ground, folks, we as humanitarians, we see the actual impact on human life.
Yeah. And
that for us is the biggest concern. So I was there a few months ago as the troops were starting to leave. I was there in Kabul in Afghanistan at that time, witnessed some of that happening. But again, standing on the mountains of Kabul and seeing the orphan children, the widows, the poverty, etc., that existed 20 years ago. It existed a few years ago when I started going to Afghanistan just a couple of years ago. It existed a few months ago. And I believe it's going to continue existing. Because while the world discusses everything that happens politically and militarily, very few people can discuss actually what goes on from a human element, from a human perspective.
So as the diplomats
in Afghanistan right now,
Imraan, I'm saying as the diplomats are running for the hills and the soldiers are exiting, what is the crisis that is left behind right now on the ground?
Well, you see, when you think about this for a second, 48% of the population of Afghanistan are under the age of 15. Half the country are children. 74% of the population are under the age of 30. Because this country has experienced 4 decades of conflict. Every possible country tried to do something in this country, and ultimately, who are the people who suffer? The human beings. So you're right, as the diplomats leave, as the foreigners leave, what does it leave? It leaves this massive void in the country of human capital. And the humanitarian crisis that unfolds, it leaves people vulnerable, widows, children, vulnerable. Now, of course, we don't know what's going to unfold in the coming days and weeks. We pray and hope that it's going to be, whatever the politics are, we pray and hope that for the people, the average person on the mountains of Kabul and in the villages of Afghanistan, in the rural parts of the country, we pray and hope that their lives and their rights will be protected. And the international community has a responsibility on that.
Yeah.
Because we all want humanity.
I'll come back to that in a moment. But Fakude, I mean, the United States, I'm sure Washington knew that when they left and pulled out of Afghanistan, they would leave the Afghan forces without that all-important American safety net. But did they underestimate the work that the Taliban has been doing in the country, at least in the last 20 years?
I think they did. I think they underestimated the resolve of the Taliban. But they also had confidence on the Afghan Defense Force, which, of course, disappointed the Americans and the NATO forces in Afghanistan. But they did underestimate the Taliban, and they underestimated the speed through which they could conquer or take over all of these cities that they've since taken. But over and above that, I think the low morale within the Afghan forces has been surprising, and I'm certain from the US and the NATO perspective has also been very disappointing, because they've spent time, energy and resources over the years trying to train the Afghan defense forces, but the Afghan defense forces had an extremely low morale because there's a very high level of corruption in Afghanistan, particularly during the time of Hamid Karzai. Started during the time of Hamid Karzai and went on to Ashraf Ghani's tenure as the president of Afghanistan, where the military was not paid on time, they were not properly fed, and most of them were neglected in very extreme and remote positions in Afghanistan. And we've seen how they reacted when it came to them actually defending the country and defending the regime or the government of Ashraf Ghani, who since fled to Tajikistan.
This inability of Washington to adjust to the situation on the ground, does it represent a major policy failure on the part of the United States? And is President Joe Biden going to admit to that, in his address?
I think they've realized that copy-pasting of solutions that work in the Western countries are not necessarily appropriate for countries like Afghanistan. So there has been that lesson, and most American officials have said so, that the biggest mistake they've made in Afghanistan was to assume that what works in the West will work in Afghanistan, particularly when it comes to the preparedness and the readiness of the defense forces. So it's been a lesson, but it's been a very expensive lesson. And of course, now the horse has bolted. It's time now to try and rectify the current situation and bring some sort of stability in Afghanistan.
Imraan, you have sources and teams there on the ground. We're seeing some images of what took place on that tarmac as the plane was taking off. What are they telling you?
Well, you see, Thabo, again, when we talk about our team on the ground there, first of all, our number one focus was their safety. That's a big concern, obviously, because there's uncertainty around it, what's happening right now. Nobody, to be honest, and I'm careful with my words for one simple reason. When I was there a few months ago, we witnessed situations where you can't explain when you're up on a mountain in Kabul and some woman tells you that she hasn't eaten for 4 days, but she gets food every few days. Ask her, how do you get food? She gets food from somebody in the military. One of the soldiers comes up the mountain, 7 hours walking or 4 hours walking up the mountain to bring her food. Okay, it's not a noble act. Initially, I thought it's a noble act. A person's part that they're getting in exchange. So wait a second, when you think about that was prior to what's happened now. So when we say things might be crazier now, I don't know how much more crazier things can get when you think about it on a human level. Our teams on the ground, firstly, we were concerned about their safety. But secondly, when you witness that plane, we all saw it on social media, etc., of people wanting to flee the country. And it could be for multiple of reasons, of course. Sometimes it's the fear more than anything else that makes someone to flee, not necessarily the reality of the situation. But don't get me wrong. When I'm in Afghanistan and Kabul and our teams on the ground there, the biggest thing for most people is that they look at what's going on around them and they see no possible future as a human being. And ultimately, when you come down to it, you and I both want to see futures for our children. So every time I'm there, these children look at you with this yearning in their eyes to want to leave the country. Even a few months ago when I was there, wanting to leave the country. Why? Because they don't see a future.
Yeah.
And that should be a message to the politicians globally and to the UN and to NATO force, all this kind of stuff. When we talk about these big words, we need to understand that every child, every widow, every person wants to see a positive future for themselves.
Yeah. Well, one of the first
and we need
things...
to ask ourselves, have we failed the community of Afghanistan?
One of the first things that is being reported, Imraan, with the Taliban takeover of Kabul, for example, is the complete cancelling out of human rights, particularly women's rights. What does that actually mean in practical terms?
Well, in practical terms, firstly, now there's conflicting stories regarding that because they've released a statement saying that they're going to protect the rights of women, etc. And of course, ultimately, we all know that it will only unfold in the coming days and weeks and months, where we will see whether action meets the words or not. Yes, there's fear amongst the female population of Afghanistan. And of course, the Taliban has now made comments about the fact that they will protect women's rights, etc., etc. We all know, the world will know in the next few days, weeks, and months what unfolds. From my perspective as the CEO of the organization, our biggest thing really is we're going to watch to see where the organizations and NGOs are globally, internationally, are allowed to operate to help the people. Because whether it's Africa, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's different parts around the world, ultimately, if an NGO or multiple NGOs are not allowed to operate effectively on the ground, that poses a massive concern. Because how do you get aid to people?
Indeed. But Fakude, very briefly, I mean, the UN Nation Security Council calling for talks to create a new government in Afghanistan. Do they have tools and means at their disposal to be able to put together that kind of an arrangement?
Well, the discussions are currently taking place in Doha, and they have been taking place for quite some time. I mean, Qatar was one of the first countries that allowed the representation of the Taliban in Doha since 2013. So when this conflict or misunderstanding between the Taliban and Afghan government started, the Qataris initiated talks between Afghan government and the Taliban. So those discussions have been taking place, and there are two very important players currently. That is Hamid Karzai, the former president of Afghanistan, is in Qatar, and Abdallah, who is one of the main players in the politics in Afghanistan. So it's anticipated that the current talks that are taking place in Qatar will lead some sort of result and will yield some kind of a way forward towards the political stability in Afghanistan. We've heard today from the spokesperson of the Taliban, Sohail Shaheen, who has confirmed that those discussions are taking place and the results of those discussions are imminent, and we're likely to see a government of some national unity of some sort that will resume the governance in Afghanistan. So it's a wait and see moment right now. But the saddest part, of course, is that while all of that happens, there is a lot of anxiety and people are panicking within Afghanistan, as we've seen the visuals today of people wanting to leave Afghanistan. Suffice to say that many of those people, of course, are all opportunistic elements who wanted to catch their ride as the number of particularly foreigners who are in Afghanistan at the moment were leaving the country to back into their own home country. So we'll have to wait and see what's going to happen in the next couple of hours.
Imraan, Choonara, CEO of Africa Muslim Agency and Senior Research Fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues. Thembisa, Fakude, appreciate your time and thanks for joining us. We, of course, are